Once someone is emotionally invested in purchasing a new pet, it's easier to be manipulated and defrauded. We want to share ways that you can be sure not to get scammed. Today's guest is Jack Whittaker. Jack is a PhD candidate in criminology with published works in the field of online fraud. He has presented at several fraud symposiums and conferences, as well as done expert interviews for both national and international news outlets. Jack also helps run a voluntary counter-fraud initiative called PetScams.com and occasionally teaches cybercrime awareness to school children. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Jack, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Glad to hear it. Can you tell me a little bit, and the audience, a little bit about your background and how you got started with PetScams.com?
Yeah, of course. Well, actually, at the moment, I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. My background with pet scams goes back maybe 4 or 5 years now. I wasn't the one that originally started that. I should say that it's run by a lunatic Irishman who's very good at what he does. But he's one of the most selfless and friendly people I've ever met. And he brought me on board because I was, looking for something a bit different to do in my free time, and it sort of grew from there. And now it takes up my whole life.
And we were talking before we hit record that the pet scams is something that's very unique to the U.S.
Yeah. So pet scams generally, they're very unique to the U.S., to Canada, to Australia, and to South Africa. And the reason why this is because consumers in the U.S., they will go on their websites and select a pet, but they don't like the idea sometimes of actually, traveling across states to visit that pet. So, for example, if you're in New York and you really want an American Kennel Club, Chihuahua, for instance, then the breeder's in Texas, so you're not going to travel that distance. And in effect, me and my fellow volunteers at PetScams.com have identified that there's, as a result, a booming economy for pet scams, which has become obscene now, to the point where it's millions of dollars every year is being lost.
Mm. And we're not talking. We're differentiating between like puppy mills, which actually have pets that are sick, versus ones that are just there is no dog involved whatsoever. There's no cat. There's no pet involved whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So there's a massive difference, with the pets that are there. It arrives and it's sort of licking its own eyeballs. That's a pet welfare issue. Whereas what we're dealing with, the seller of the animal actually has no intention of delivering it, and they're based in West Africa, which I can talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, so let's talk through, who run the scams, who are they targeting,
of course,
and kind of what you've learned over the years in dealing with them.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and sometimes the simplest questions are the most complex to answer. So this might be quite a long-winded response. So in effect, pet scams originally come from Cameroon in about 90% of cases, and I've actually spoken to some of the offenders that run these scams. And effectively, from what I've been told, it could be a complete lie because, criminals lie.
No.
But exactly. But some of the excuse behind it was it comes from the Amazonian region of Cameroon, which is the English-speaking region. And it was effectively Nigerian 419 guys in the 90s that sort of brought cybercrime with them. And the Cameroonians ran with it then and decided, well, actually, what can we defraud people in the West for? Pets might be a good one. So, in effect, it's diffused outside of the country. And then also what's really interesting, as these offenders move abroad for things like study or work opportunity, they also take their cybercrime activities with them. And some of the most successful and prominent money mules operating in the US, for example, are Cameroonians. And they receive stolen money and send it back to their fellow colleagues back home. So in terms of how the scam operates, it's a very interesting story and one that is so simple, but it's done to perfection. And what's effectively happens is an offender will create a website, which is a very easy thing to do in this day and age.
Yep.
They will find a domain name registrar who sells the domain name. And it is usually a registrar, or it could be a registrar who is friendly towards scams. I won't say the names of companies because I don't like being sued. But what we found in our research at petscams.com is that the offenders actually they congregate towards certain infrastructures that are friendly towards scammers. So we've got our domain name now. Then what the scammer does is they might either build a website themselves, or they'll actually go to a colleague who might be a friend of theirs, down the road in Douala or Bamenda or wherever they're based. And these guys, they specialize in building pet scam websites. They'll pay them a fee, and hey presto, we have a website now. So we've got a website at this stage, but unfortunately, that website isn't going to actually generate any visitors unless we market that website. So what they then do is they set up Google Ads, and they just blast Google with adverts, and they spend insane amounts of money to the point where some of the actual losses from victims are being reinvested into the Google Ads on new websites. Mm-hmm. And I've actually found that some of the websites are spending over $10,000 on Google Ads, which is phenomenal.
Are they doing it with stolen credit cards?
Yeah, so it's a mixture of data trading and also reinvestment of previous victims' funds that are lost, which creates something quite interesting along the lines of there's quite a lot of companies that are profiting off the victims of cybercrime, which is sort of the ugly part that never really gets discussed. So we've got a website at this stage, and we've started marketing it. Now we have someone who's interested in a pet who's found it on Google Ads. I should also say too that there are countless Facebook groups, Pinterest groups, Twitter pages, etc., that are advertising these fake pets at this stage. They can't advertise on platforms such as Amazon because buying and selling animals isn't allowed on their terms of service. So someone then contacts the website and says, I want to buy your really fluffy looking pet. Bella, the cavoodle puppy, looks really, cute. And they'll say, yes, that's very nice. We're selling at 50% off, because what they're looking at doing is appealing to what's called visceral appeals, which evokes an I like that response from the victim. That will be things like, the very cute looking pictures, the 50% off, etc. So that gets the victim hooked at that stage. And it's also worth mentioning too, it's not just greedy people that are hooked into this scam. It is people who are suffering from cancer and need a pet a pet to get them through it. It's veterans with PTSD. It's children who might be being bullied at school. It's also the vulnerable and elderly too. So the AARP, for example, we've done work with in the past, and my colleagues just done a podcast with them. And then on top of that too, you have got, unfortunately, people that are greedy and they're looking for a purebred pet at a massively discounted rate. So at that stage, the victim is hooked. They really want this pet. They've opened a correspondence with the offender at that point, and they'll pay the deposit fee. The deposit fee will be paid. It used to be Western Union MoneyGram. That's dying now because they keep getting sued.
Yeah.
These days, it is primarily Zelly, and also the criminals tailor make the payment process depending on the country. So in America, it's also Walmart to Walmart transfer. In Australia and South Africa, it is bank accounts which are used. I have a feeling that's because of the money laundering regulations aren't quite as tight there. But that's a general hypothesis at this stage. So at that stage, the victim has paid for the pet, and the offender at this point has realized we can defraud them for more at this stage. This is great because they're really hooked into it. So what the offender does then is they own a shipping company website, and they will recontact the victim under the guise of being a shipping agent, and they'll say, oh, by the way, we're going to charge you for what's called a temperature-controlled shipping crate, despite the fact that airplanes are already pressure-controlled environments, which this is where the price as well actually increases now. So they charge more than a regular shipping company would, because the consumer is at that point hooked.
Mm-hmm.
Then they might, in effect, then the story narrative continues and continues, and it just snowballs until the victim realizes that they are being defrauded, or they essentially run out of money in some very sad cases that I've come across. So they'll charge for things like vet fees. They've adapted to coronavirus, so they charge for COVID vaccine fees, quarantine fees, the whole song and dance, really. In one really exceptional case that I came across, a woman actually lost $15,000 because the offender claimed there had been a plane crash, and he introduced the lawyer narrative of "I'm suing you." Yeah, so really, I mean, it's about 15% technology here, 85% social engineering, and it really is social engineering at its finest.
Do you see issues where the scammers are cloning legitimate breeder websites?
All the time. It is so easy to actually clone a legitimate website, and there is very little that can stop it. And effectively, you can use a program such as HTTPS track, and it will download the whole website's content. And then you just slap a domain name, change some of the pictures. And also you can use a thing called a tumbler on the text, so you can rip off someone's website and to stop consumers from doing string searches. It can then it will spill out the sentences rearranged to prevent plagiarism checks. However, that does create some very unusual situations. One of them was, I think it was a commodities scam, and they nicked it from a cow farm. So it was like, we milk our peanuts twice a week. And I was like, you can't milk a peanuts. Yeah. So yeah, it creates quite a bewildering situation. But in reality, if the guy who's building the websites knows what he's doing, it can be really, really good. And also as well, they lock the website sometimes, so you can't actually, do a direct copy and paste. You've actually got to go into the source code to get the good stuff out.
Yeah, there's
a
little bit of JavaScript will keep you from being able to do a grab.
Yeah, exactly. In effect, it's a very elaborate process, but it's something at the same time that's really cost effective and very simple to do.
So, what are people supposed to do to make sure that they're dealing with a legitimate real breeder as opposed to a scammer?
Oh, it's incredibly simple. Have a video chat with a legitimate breeder. Make them show you the puppy with, the pups. Make them show you the mother with the pups. Scammers will adapt to that in the future. One thing that we've learned from doing this for 5 years is that every time we say something, they adapt to it very quickly, which is very, very annoying. So I'm sure they're going to find a way around it. But for now, the best advice is to video chats. Or, the golden rule, of course, go and visit the breeder in person. Maybe, or for that matter, change the circumstances. Maybe you don't need, that pedigree puppy. Go to the pound, see what's there. So it's quite simple things. There's no, really technical stuff that needs doing, like going into the whois, the name servers, the IP addresses, and fishing around. It's all very basic things, and it's one thing that frustrates me the most about InfoSec in general. There's always a lot of people splashing jargon around and scary words to make themselves feel cleverer, like the word phishing, for example, when in reality it's just very simple things.
Yeah. I know when my wife and I were looking to buy a dog, we had started looking at breeders for schnauzers, and we found one that was, if it came time to pick up the dog, we could drive there, but it wasn't it wasn't close enough to drive out to do a visit.
Yeah.
So my wife had been emailing the person back and forth. I think they'd even had a couple of phone calls. And I was like, okay, this, the prices were within the normal range for the breed, and everything kind of seemed right. And my wife goes, "Hey, I'd love to have my aunt come out and just visit." And my aunt was like 15 minutes away from where this person claimed to be. And once coming out to visit was said, they went dark. They never picked up the phone. They never responded to emails. They didn't respond to text messages. So it's it was a scam.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've actually come across a Cameroonian pet scammer then. But also on that story as well, what's really interesting too is that there's innocent third parties who are being damaged by this scam. And not many people think about them, and it's just starting to gain a little bit of traction. So quite often we get, I should say as well, that scammers will find houses for sale and claim that they're from there on their addresses, and it will always be where you're not from. So they'll change it, and if you're from New York, they'll be from California, and vice versa. But what's really interesting is once those houses are actually sold, we speak to people who've just moved in, and they've got 50 very angry people turning up at their houses. And in some cases, it's got to the point where they think they're a criminal and they're getting death threats and bricks thrown through their windows type thing.
Oh.
So it's really quite scary, some of it.
And so we ultimately did end up buying a dog from a breeder. Yeah. And she had I watched her posts on Facebook, and so she's had similar issues where people have used her name, the pictures of her dogs, and are trying to sell them. And when something goes wrong, they come after her, not the scammer.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, exactly. And there's a lot of knock-on effects that people don't really consider. Some of them are quite ugly, as I've talked about, and they're not going to be discussed openly. For example, certain companies that profit from the lax registration process in domains, for example, and what is the role of ICANN in all this, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers? Are they the regulator of the police? Can they do more about this crime? They're saying they're not, but actually they've got a job to uphold who is. So again, it's quite an interesting dichotomy going on there. You've then got the hosting providers. Are they bulletproof hosters, for example? And on top of that, there's all sorts of checks and balances in play. And then, of course, you've got the direct and indirect victims. You've got the legitimate shipping companies whose websites are being ripped. IPATA, the Pet Transport Association, their logo is just being abused to death now. So it will get to the point where, effectively, if things continue as they are, their logo as a trust on a website might not be worth much in the near term. And finally, as well, as you've just pointed out, you have pet sellers, and people who have Instagram pages of their pets who are just getting them ripped constantly. And there's a lot of implications for these people, which is quite scary.
Yeah, and it's, I think it's one thing if you have a purely domestic scam where the victim, the platform, and the scammer are all in the same country. With the challenge that I see so much is with the international scams. It's the domain was registered in Slovenia with a stolen credit card. The hosting was paid for is run out of Romania with a stolen credit card. The victim's in the United States. There's a money mule in Canada, and the scammers, somewhere else. Pick the country, and it's like, okay, so do you want to spend $100,000 trying to get your $1,000 back?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, a really interesting one, as you said about this sort of dispersed network of infrastructure is, I remember seeing there's a big thing going on at the moment because a pet scammer got arrested in Romania, and there was a lot of song and dance around it, and clearly a lot of backpatting going on where they were saying we won't tolerate COVID-19 scams in the US. And I was just sat there thinking, okay, great, we've got one pet scammer now. There's probably about 30,000 that are sat in Cameroon, but let's give each other, belly rubs and say it's all great. So much of it is a whack-a-mole game. Just because you shut down this one website, even if you get that one scammer, it's not like the whole cottage scam industry is now, hey, we've shut down the entire industry because we arrested this one person and put him in jail for 30 days. Exactly, yeah. But there at the same time, though, there are some really, really good takeaway points for US law enforcement to focus on. One of them is definitely money mules. Because in a sense, there's so many different ways that money mules can be recruited. Some of them, for example, aren't even actually offenders themselves. Well, they're directly offenders, but they're unaware of what's actually happening. So the different types of money mule are there's so-called mystery shopper or payment processing assistant money mules, which are recruited via job scams, where you get taken on and you get paid $22,000 for 3 or 4 hours of work a day. And eventually what will happen is you'll rock up to Western Union, the bank have locked your account, and then you'll go, what's going on? Why can't I send this money to Cameroon for my job? Western Union will laugh and they will say, oh, by the way, you should only be sending money to friends or family here. And you will say to them, oh, I do know them. I actually work for this company. Western Union will then raise their eyebrows and laugh even more, because at that point they'll say, you shouldn't be doing employment work through Western Union.
Yeah.
So that's one type. The other type is romance scams, where they can recruit money mules. So, hey, babies, do you fancy sending me $3,000, from one bank account to another type thing? Then the third is the sort of the knowing mules, the people who are actually in on the scam. And in the case of, I've noticed with pet scams, Cameroonians actually use these types of mules a lot more, whereby a student from Cameroon goes to the US, probably gets there and realizes it's more expensive than they thought. And then they're offered, some cheap money, which involves picking up Western Union payments and then sending them via bank wire to Cameroon. And what was really interesting about that too is we did a thing with a news company from Indianapolis recently where we found out who a money mule was, and we managed to get him pulled over on a traffic stop. And he had, I think, 13 fake IDs in his car at the time, which was really quite phenomenal. So it just sort of gives you a sense of the scale. If he's got 13 fake IDs for 13 different pickups that he does, there's probably quite a lot of money that goes through this process.
Yeah, I've seen a number of scam baiters and whatnot who have helped facilitate the takedowns of the mules, and the amount of cash that they have on them at any one time is staggering.
Yeah. I mean, some of it is a bit iffy though. I mean, there's some types of muling that I'm personally still learning about. For example, we did a news interview with Atlanta recently, and we found that there was a really shady syndicate of strippers who were all working together, and they were all money laundering for Cameroonian pet scammers. And the money was being sent to this strippers. It was their payment accounts or whatever it was, like Venmo or something, I can't remember. And in the end, they called her out and said, what's going on here? And she said, oh, I think my account was hacked, despite systematic payments, which we track through our websites going there. But yeah, I'd really be interested to see how she got involved in that, because we went out, well, I mean, I enjoy stalking people sometimes, and I went through all of her social media followers, and I couldn't find a single link to Cameroon, because with money mules, there's always that one person that you can pin it to. And yeah, nothing. So there's a lot to learn still.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is as soon as you figure out how it works, they've pivoted on to some other technique.
Yeah, I mean, there was a criminologist called Paul Ekblom, and he said we're constantly in technology crime in an arms race with offenders, whereby crime prevention does one thing, offenders are always 2 steps ahead, which is just the law of things.
Yeah, and I don't think that's unique to internet crimes. That's just the nature of crime in and of itself. Is, well, we don't want to get caught, so we have to do something the police can't figure out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a bit like if I wanted to go and rob a bank and I use some high-powered, cutting tool, and then the bank installs some better vault that can repel it, and then I go out and buy an even better cutting tool. That's the type of thing. I should also say as well, with pet scams, one thing that's really interesting about it is that, despite the emotional impact it has on people, no one really cares about it still, because it doesn't make anyone any money to actually tackle it.
Yeah.
In cybersecurity. So it's left to volunteers like us. And I was speaking to my colleague the other day about it, and he said, we shouldn't be doing this. We don't want to be doing it, but we sort of feel we have to, if that makes sense. Not because we're sort of Batman type people. but just because we're quite good at it, even though we make not a lot from it. And secondly, also, there's an issue with monetary thresholds here, which is that if you're a fraudster committing internet crime, you manage to set up a scam defrauding everyone in the US for $1. You have the perfect crime because it will never get looked into.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way things are in some U.S. states right now. They've raised the minimum threshold for a crime to go from a misdemeanor to a felony. So it's okay, well, we'll just keep the crime right under the felony amount. So even if the person does get arrested, it's a citation, they're released, and they're back out committing the same crime the next day because, well, there's no cost to them, and you haven't put a barrier up to them being able to perform the crime.
Yeah. And even in the case of Atlanta that I was just telling you about, the victim was actually suing the woman in civil court, and I was just screaming, going, "It's not civil, it's criminal. It's not a trade dispute." So yeah, there has to be more education in terms of what you're dealing with. It's the tip of the iceberg in terms of at what stage does bad customer service turn into systematic fraud.
Yeah. And I think the one thing you always tell people is to watch out for the non-refundable payment methods.
Oh yeah, big one. Especially things like Bitcoin, Zelly. Zelly even have a payment policy now on their website saying, please don't buy pets using us, because the problem's got that bad. And then, of course, Western Union, MoneyGram, Walmart to Walmart transfer, all that sort of good stuff. Consumers should never, ever use to pay for things.
Yeah, I'm surprised in a sense that Western Union can actually remain in business. I don't know anybody who has legitimately used Western Union to send or receive money. I've only, every time that I've heard of someone that I know who's used it, they have been a victim of a scam.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't imagine how the platform can exist when from my perspective, I'm sure there's legitimate uses, but it seems to only exist for the benefit of fraud these days.
Yeah, I mean, it was also the case with, I think, drug cartels as well that were using money transfer offices. So yeah, it's a real mind puzzler, and because as you just said, if there's always going to be a Western Union though. If we shut one method down, there will be another one that pops up, and Bitcoin seems to be one of the main proprietors or the main enablers of cybercrime in this day and age. And a really interesting example of that is I should note as well that pets are one of a very small proportion of scams that these offenders run. They are running marijuana, drug scams, pharmaceutical scams, cancer medication, opioid. It's all being reflexive to what's going on in different countries, mostly in the States. So they started running opioid scams once the opioid crisis got big. Private healthcare means people are going online to look for their own cheaper medication. That gives, the boys in Cameroon a good opportunity. Marijuana legalization means that people are more willing to buy it online. Guns is a massive one at the moment that we're seeing. After Biden won the election, but I'm not going into politics. Then PlayStation 5s, and there's some other ones out there that are a bit weird that I don't know why they're being concentrated upon, but it's happening. Some of the weird ones are human organs. I keep seeing hearts, kidneys, and lungs for sale. I think they might be targeting people in India and China. And also sex dolls is another big one, with suspiciously looking aged doll.
No one's going to report that crime.
Yeah, exactly. And pinball machines, which I'm picking a lot. Yeah, pinball machines, which I'm seeing a lot of. Yeah, exactly. But again, as you just said there, with drug scams, for instance, no one is going to report it if you take the chance of buying crack cocaine on a website and you're an addict whose dealer whose dealer can't get you for the usual supply. A website says same day delivery, Bitcoin me here, and you're desperate for your hit. Then who are you going to tell? in that famous quote, criminals have no recourse. So if you can victimize other, and I'm saying criminals in a very loose way, because I think people who are suffering from drug addiction, they can be, but usually they're not. They're victims.
It's people who are in a circumstance where they're not going to report the crimes for fear of reprisal.
Exactly. Yes,
that's a nice politically correct way of saying it.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll just wait for the death threats to come in now for the prior comments. But yeah, exactly. It's all to do with things that people cannot or do not want to report.
Yeah.
So I started logging that on the second site called scam.directory, and it made me realize that the pet scams really are the tip of the iceberg. And there's what I'm hoping, with my academic work, I can call a portfolio crime. And that could be transferable to things like phishing, BEC. For example, I'm well aware of Agari, who do fantastic work on BEC. And I remember reading one of their reports recently, which was a case called Exaggerated Lion, and it was a BEC gang, and that BEC was also tied to romance fraud. And they were using the romance victims as mules in that case. So I'm hoping, even with these seemingly insignificant websites that, as you say, are defrauding people who cannot or do not want to report a crime, there might be other aspects that are worth exploring, which I think is very important to document everything.
Yeah.
I know for a fact, though, the reason why I built that why me and my colleague have built that second website is because if law enforcement came to us and we had pets listed next to cocaine websites, they might be less inclined to work with us then.
Yeah, it's applying what you've learned in the pet scam trade to, okay, how do we apply this to other illicit trade?
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. And also what I've learned from speaking to offenders is they often deal in, firstly, there's a hierarchy of scams, I should say. And this is something really interesting that I wasn't aware of until I started speaking to them. So at the bottom, you've got like drug marijuana scams, and at the top, you've got what's called company fraud. That doesn't explicitly refer to as BEC or defrauding an accounts department or an executive. It's actually wholesaling commodities usually. And if you can claim to sell that in bulk, then you can make an incredible amount of money doing it. And I was speaking to a business owner recently who was defrauded in a wood scam from Ukraine, and he's in Germany, and they took him for 8,000 euros. So it just sort of shows the different cheese that they can put on the mousetrap. Mm-hmm. And the second thing I should also say too is that the web devs over in Cameroon, they absolutely hate their clients, from what many of them have told me. The reason why they've been willing to speak to me is might sound a bit corny or cheesy, but they don't actually like what their clients are doing, but they are doing what they're doing as a way of making a living, which is quite a sad thing, I suppose.
Yeah, and I've heard that a lot in talking with people who have interacted with the scammers directly. It's like, well, I don't want to do this, but I'm trying to put bread on the table. I'm trying to feed my kids, and this is the only option that's available to me.
Yeah, definitely. But that being said, I mean, I do consider the web devs to be offenders themselves, because they are providing an integral service for scammers. What I do find pretty sickening, though, is how some of the victims are effectively tortured after the scam takes place. And I've already talked before about how some of the victims will be sent by a scammer on a wild goose chase, maybe for 6 hours, to meet the breeder halfway to pick up a pet that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Another way of tormenting a victim is through blackmail. So if you're importing a monkey, for example, or I can't remember the name of it, arowana fish, which is protected under CITES, or something like anything that's restricted in the US, they will then claim to be from a US agency and say, "Hi, we want you to pay a fee or a bribe, as it were." And they'll claim to be law enforcement. They'll say, yeah, we're going to come and arrest you. Also the same with puppies. They'll say to the victims, we're going to charge you with animal abandonment if you don't pay the quarantine fee. And then the last one is just incoherent threats, which I've seen some pretty shocking stuff. I mean, one time I had a woman who was just absolutely crying to me on Skype saying they've threatened to come to my house and rape me in front of my daughter whilst my husband watches. So there's some pretty horrendous stuff going on, really.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenging things is once someone has been victimized by a scam, their name, their contact information gets passed around these groups of scammers, and they become this big target for anything and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And then you'll have recovery scams. But what's really interesting is, unlike in other types of crime, cybercrime, the recovery scam actually happens as part of the initial hook phase where the shipping process starts. So in a sense, that's why I consider pet scams to be quite clever, because they'll do it whilst the victim is already being defrauded. Yeah. And just to add that little bit of a sweetener onto the scam itself, and to prevent the victim from reclaiming the money, in the shipping page, they will create fake trackers on the shipping page and give the victim a code. And it will show, 2 weeks, for example, or however long it takes for the gang to reclaim the money, just to give them enough time that the victim has no chance of getting that back.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the things that people will do to separate other people from their money. It's sickening.
Yeah, it's a very scary world.
So if people want to find more about the pet scams as well as your scam directory, where can they find you and those sites?
Yeah, sure. So the first one, petscams.com, is as is. Scam directory is scam.directory. If anyone wants to get hold of me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on... you can also contact me through my email, which I'll share with you afterwards. And lastly, as well, if you want to use our data, we're more than welcome. We want as many people to use our data as possible. It's just starting to be used by university students now. I've got colleagues that are using it, and they're doing some really terrific stuff with our data, which really can give some love to what is an underloved type of cybercrime. Mm-hmm. So if law enforcement or IT devs or InfoSec professionals want to use it, just get in touch with me, please.
Oh, that's awesome. Super appreciate you making that all available. And it's a service that you're not charging for, I assume, correct?
Yeah, and we only accept donations, and even then, it's we make just enough to keep the server running, just to feed that little hamster going around in the ball.
Yeah, the poor little hamster.
Yeah, exactly.
Jack, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Prey podcast. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Jack Whittaker can be found at easyprey.com/103.